Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Chairman Stireman, members of the committee, staff, and the many out-of-town guests we have today. On behalf of our citizens, our City Commission, and the Mayor's Office, welcome to Hobbs and Lee County. Also, thanks for agreeing to have your meeting at the Center of Recreational Excellence, or the CORE as we call it. This facility is a result of a quality of life initiative for Hobbs and Lee County that consists of a partnership between Lee County, the City of Hobbs, New Mexico Junior College, Hobbs Municipal Schools, and the University of Southwest and the J.F. Maddox Foundation. This $63.5 million facility was opened on June 2nd, 2018 and was paid for through funds by the Foundation, the City, NMJC, and Hobbs Municipal Schools. We are very proud of it, and it has proven to be a great destination for our local community and a powerful economic development tool as we continue to diversify our local economy. When you have a break, I would encourage you to take a quick tour to see all the many features that the building offers for all ages. Again, thanks for choosing Hobbs. We hope to have you back soon.
Thank you, Mayor. And we'll hear from Dr. Kelvin.
President of New Mexico Junior College.
Good morning. I too want to welcome you to Hobbs and Lee County. On behalf of New Mexico Junior College, our students, our staff, our faculty, our Board of Regents, we're glad that you're having your meetings here. We always enjoy having the opportunity to have you here in this part of the state. Literally, if you have a chance, I know Sam talked about touring the CORE. New Mexico Junior College is just to our north here, past the event center. Literally, if you want to circle the campus, it's built on a circle. So if you'd like to circle through and look at some of the different buildings and projects we have going, we'd love to have you, host you, and have you take a look while you're in this part of the country. So welcome to Hobbs, welcome to Lee County, and thank you for your time.
Thank you both very much. And we're, again, happy to be here. Okay, moving on to our 9:40 panel, will Scott Palmer and Don Gallegos please sit down? And we'll, at the... One of the big safety
considerations. I may just use my outside voice. Let's hear me.
Can we maybe switch mics, sir?
What's that?
Can we see if one of the other ones will work better for you?
Just hold it.
I'm a politician and a musician. I should know how to work a microphone. Okay. There we go. Folks can hear me okay? Great. So rail safety is one of the big issues with this discussion. All of the proposed material, spent nuclear fuel, high-level nuclear waste that would come into this facility at this point has been said to be planned to come in via rail. So for this hearing, we invited every railroad in the state to come and testify. Several of them declined. They said it was premature. We have gentlemen in front of us who are concerned with safety issues, infrastructure issues, who did take advantage of this opportunity. We very much appreciate it, so that we, as a legislative committee and citizens, can learn more about rail safety, because this is a huge component. Even though the waste may be destined for this site, in fact, it will come by potentially all corners of this state, and citizens of the state need to consider that. So, gentlemen, with that, why don't we start with Scott? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Scott, would you start by introducing yourself and your background a little bit?
I'm a microphone technician. My name is Scott Palmer. I've been a locomotive engineer for 27 years. Prior to that, I was in the Navy for 6 years as a nuclear components welder. Currently, I am the nuclear policy analyst for the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Training, the BLET. I am also the assistant safety coordinator for our task force that goes out with the NTSB and investigates train wrecks. I'm also the Oregon State Legislative Chairman in charge of health and safety. And then Monday through Friday, I run a train like every other engineer. So that's my background, and I live in Southern Oregon. I've been attending DOE meetings for 20 years now. Originally the DOE tech, And then later on, it morphed into the national transportation stakeholders forum, and I attend those things. And there's quite a few things that I've picked up over the years. One of the key issues that we have as railroaders is a lack of protection when it comes to radiation. Coming from the nuclear Navy, we have a certain way of doing things. And then when you get to the railroad, they do nothing at all. There's a loss of process. We used to have a term for the Navy, and that is measure with micrometers, mark with chalk, and cut with an axe. And we're at the axe end of the whole process. We've got three main regulating agencies as far as radiation and the radioactive shipments go. That's the DOE and the 10 CFR. We've got 49 CFR, which is the Department of Transportation, Federal Railroad Administration. And then we've got Department of Labor under OSHA, which is CFR 29. We have a problem with those because we don't fall under the radiation protection afforded by DOE to their employees and contractors. The FRA, while it sets radiation limits in the cab of a locomotive, allows them to be at a level that a member of the public cannot be exposed to. So we fall under OSHA. And the big problem I have with OSHA is it is a standard that seems to have been written not with transportation in mind, but with storage and production. There is no administrative dose limits, meaning OSHA says you can get 5,000 millirounds per year. That's fine. In the Navy, I could have gotten 2,000 millirounds per year, but they gave it to me in 5 milliround increments. That's an administrative dose level. If you get that, you got to go back and see them. They got to okay you to get any more. OSHA's not like that. It doesn't require any kind of protection or dosimetry. It doesn't have declared pregnant worker protection. There's no radiation limit for a female worker who's pregnant. This is 2018. I can't believe that's a new standard. We have women in the railroad. It seems to me that that part of the OSHA manual was written way before women were in the workplace. And back when we had to produce weapons and be a major world power. So that's a huge issue that we do have. We don't fall under any kind of guidelines. Currently, when we do have radioactive waste shipments, and we do it nationwide, there is no dosimetry whatsoever for the crew. One place provided dosimetry to the crew one time, and I asked the person why, and they said, oh, it's for our own interest, we just wanted to know. I said, did you inform them of how much radiation they're exposed to? Oh, no, we didn't think to do that. So there is nothing. We don't have any ALAR principles, and that's what DOE is founded on. That's an acronym that stands for as low as reasonably achievable. It's a way to keep your exposure low as well as that of the public. So we have no training in those. We have...
Hey, Scott? Sorry, okay, I think we might have had a technological breakthrough.
Oh, yay.
So apparently if we use just one mic at a time and all the others are turned off, so the one that's turned on is the work. So everybody who has a mic, make sure they're turned off. And you turn yours on and...
How's that?
Oh,
All right.
Thank you.
So we've got a lot of problems with the way that these shipments just show up and are handled just as if they were any other kind of hazardous material. Of course, with the Department of Energy standards for radiation, they are very good. They've got pregnant workers limits, they've got limits for the member of the public, which we consider ourselves. But the big problem there is the shipments emit more radiation than a member of the public can receive. And the FRA allows more exposure than a member of the public can receive. DOE considers our dose to be occupational, and this is without any kind of training whatsoever. I was an occupational radiation worker in the Navy. I know what kind of training that is required to handle this material safely, to keep my exposure low, and to keep the exposure to the public low. The only training the railroads have right now is placard recognition. You have to be able to recognize a radioactive placard, and then know where it goes in a train, and that's it. There's nothing about keeping your own exposure low, nothing about tracking your own exposure. It is something that we wouldn't have done in the Navy. We wouldn't have handled radioactive material like this. And that was 30 years ago. So the railroads have not caught up with the need. And when we're looking at a 24-year shipping campaign, followed probably by another 24 or 30-year DOE shipping campaign, things can't go on like they're going to go on. So the FRA, in and of itself, can set dose limits in the engine and for the shipment, but they don't control the radiation levels in the yard. That falls to OSHA. And OSHA does not know this. I've talked to 2 OSHA inspectors and said, by the way, do you know that once shipping starts, you guys are the ones who have to measure the radiation limits in all railroad fixed facilities? And then they said, no, we don't have the training, we don't have the manpower. So training is a huge issue that we have. And the biggest problem is when you look at the railroads in general and you're talking 100,000 employees, how do you get all those people trained? The standards that the American Association of Railroads set for the types of equipment to be used hauling this requires training that no locomotive engineer currently has, with the exception of maybe 50 or 60 people in Minnesota. And that would be an ECP braking system. So that makes me think the railroads don't know what's coming when. I think this is going to take them all by surprise. So we do have issues about security as well. Since this is an open meeting, I won't go into detail on quite a few of those things. We do have problems with the glazing standards on the windows. The FRA only requires them to stop at 22 short. The only requirement for a lock on a locomotive is the bathroom door. Now, the railroads have put locks on the outside of the locomotive, but not on the inside. So we can lock the engine up once we get off, but we can't lock ourselves in. There's a big problem with the way the railroad tests crews, and if we're hauling spent nuclear fuel or high-level radioactive waste, if you get stopped suddenly and unexpectedly, you need to understand that we have to view that as a possible threat. But if the railroad is doing it through testing, that undermines the crew's ability to determine whether or not there's been a threat to the shipment. Protesters are also going to be a problem. We have a huge problem with the special agents that work for the railroad police. I know where I'm from, the nearest one is 5 hours away, and I don't think it would be much different here either. When we talk about the casks and the shipments themselves, one of the biggest concerns that we do have is the testing requirements that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission performs on these Type B casks. 2 of them in particular are a drop test. One is a 30-foot free drop on a hard, essentially unyielding surface, and the other is a 30-inch drop on a 6-inch spike. Respectively, the speeds at impact on that is 29.9 miles an hour and 9.9 miles an hour. And then they're okay to move at 50 miles an hour on the railroad. These tests also don't have a fuel assembly inside, so we don't know what would happen to the fuel assembly. It seems very strange to me to test something at an impact speed of 30 miles an hour and then okay it for a shipment of 50 miles an hour. We would like to see those casks tested to the point where they mirror the actual transportation conditions that they'll be undergoing. And there is a problem with the fully engulfing fire that the NRC tests for about a 30-minute period. And our concern is much of our railroads are so remote, if we need help, that help is going to be an hour, hour and a half out. 30 minutes is not really a realistic time frame. There was one type of cask in particular, an NEC legal weight truck cask that used lead as the shielding. And the NRC did a study about what would happen in a Baltimore type tunnel fire where there was a derailment in a tunnel under the city of Baltimore that burned uncontrolled. And they decided that this cask would have survived. But when they showed me the thermal imaging or the thermal conductive properties from their test, within 2 hours, the internal temperature of the cask reached the melting point of the lead shielding. Now that would cause the lead either to slump, or if the cask had been breached or cracked, to melt out. And then you've got an unshielded source. And since that's an internal component, there wouldn't be any way for a railroader to know that that thing was emitting lethal amounts of radiation at this point. And we don't think that is a safe cask to go on the railroad at any point. So our radiological concerns, there is not planned to be any kind of radiation monitor on the lead locomotive. If something happens, we should be the canary in the coal mine, but it doesn't look like anything like that is going to take place. There's a high off-link potential exposure. Off-link means not to the crew itself, but to other adjacent workers. And there could be a high on-link radiation for the crew itself. For instance, if the conductor has to go back, tie handbrakes, fix an air hose, a knuckle, he's going to be in a very high radiation area. Well, not very high according to the DOE, but he could see as much as 40 millirem an hour on the footpath just walking by. This is far more than a member of the public can be exposed to. And keep in mind, our members are not trained to know how to protect themselves from radiation. There's only 3 ways. That's time, distance, and shielding. That is the core principle, but we don't even have that as training. So as far as I'm concerned, the railroads are not prepared to ship these things safely. We have issues that we need to address. There's still time to do it, but until they make the time, we do have concerns about the health and safety of our members as well as the public. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, John.
Good morning, Senator, Chairman, and representatives. I'm Donald Gallegos. I represent SMART, which is Sheet Metal Air Rail Transportation Division. It's a union that we cover BNSF Railway, Amtrak, Union Pacific. Also have bus drivers in Farmington, New Mexico, and I also represent NMRX in Albuquerque. As far as my background goes, I am a locomotive engineer. I run between Belen, New Mexico and Springerville, Arizona. I run coal trains, and that's my regular job. Outside of that, you might have seen me at the legislature. I'm the state legislative director for our union, so I do have a lot of contact with you in Santa Fe. But before I was on the railroad, I was in the Navy for 21 years. I'm a retired Navy chief. I did go to Navy Nuclear Power School for a few months. And I lived for 3.5 years above number 2 reactor on the USS Nimitz. So by the time I retired, I went back to that ship as a chief, and a part of my job was chemical, biological, and radiological training. So I do have a pretty good background, and as with Scott here, I agree that there's no way even near the safety that we have in the Navy as compared to what is outside the Navy, and in particular with the railroad. I sat and visited with people in Carlsbad. It used to be Southwest Railroad down here until they had a death a few years ago. Mainline switch was left open and killed an engineer. So BNSF Railway took it over. And because it was taken over, they were just a contractor to BNSF, Southwest Railroad. Looking at the tracks, they're not even in satisfactory condition to do the job they're doing now. BNSF Railway is going to increase number of trains in this area, oil trains, about 80 per month from what they're running right now. But that's not necessarily all loaded trains. Half are loaded and then the others are empties. So specifically, that is a concern. Right now, the way we classify the tracks that come from Carlsbad to Clovis, New Mexico, we call that dark territory, and it's not computer controlled. Top speed of the train is 49 miles an hour. But unfortunately, there are about 40 restrictions between Carlsbad and Clovis
40 restrictions that restrict the speed of that train. Most of them are 40 mph. There are a bunch that are 10 miles an hour, and some of them are 25 miles an hour. So that's going to restrict the security of the train overall, because the way it's designed, the train should be able to get from Clovis, New Mexico to Carlsbad with one crew under 12 hours. That's not possible right now with the number of restrictions, track restrictions that they have. And then that goes into play with your security. Yesterday, there was a truck hit a train at a crossing in Carlsbad, caused a big fire. And since we've taken over the line, there have been 24 derailments, which is highly unusual. Now, the condition of the track is inferior to what it would be on the Transcon. That's the tracks that cut across New Mexico, east to west. And then the Union Pacific has a major line that goes from El Paso, Texas into northern New Mexico. Those are the good tracks. Those are the tracks that trains run 70 miles an hour. They're the ones that run all your UPS and your high priority freight. What comes down here primarily is what comes out of the mines locally, and oil and sand cars. So it's slow going and frustrating for the crews here. And I have to agree with Mr. Palmer here that the crews have no idea when it comes down to hauling nuclear waste, spent nuclear fuel rods, because the education level of the general public in America, all they know about nuclear power is what they learned on the Simpsons cartoon. They think it's a little green thing that glows. Well, it's bad stuff. No, it does not explode. No, you have to have critical mass, and this is spent nuclear fuel. There's a safe way to transport it. There's a safe way to live around it. But we are nowhere near the safety level of what we should be to transport it. And I'd like to know if there's any questions after that.
Thank you, gentlemen. Turn your microphone on. We'll kind of ping pong back and forth there.
Anybody have questions? Welcome. Okay. Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this one for Mr. Palmer. Are new materials currently being transported in the country via rail?
Yes, sir, they are. There are shipments of uranium hexafluoride shipments, dirty dirt. There's quite a few that go on at different parts. I know in Kentucky there's a lot of uranium hexafluoride shipments right now. But as far as the spent fuel or the high-level waste, no. There is some foreign research reactor fuel that comes into South Carolina from time to time. Nothing out here in the western U.S. of that same caliber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Palmer, are there any training requirements that are extraordinary to normal operations that would be considered mandatory in order to transport these nuclear materials currently?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Scott, we have qualification as hazmat workers. And primarily what that means is when you hire out with the railroad, you get trained as a hazmat worker, and then every few years you take a brief 10-question refresher course. Beyond that, we don't have any experience to understand, and obviously I do understand radioactive material, and I'm fairly well steeped in it, but the average person doesn't understand the types of radiation, how they affect people, how far they travel, what can shield them, or even what the first response would be if they were in an incident or accident. I would say most engineers would say cut and run, which means cut your power off and run away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Palmer, would you consider with the appropriate training and processes in place, would you consider this material to be safely transportable?
Mr. Scott, absolutely I would. Radioactive material does not frighten me. I know it can be transported safely. The fact that we haven't done it for the last 40 years is somewhat troubling. But we do have time to improve, and it can be transported safely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Palmer.
Mr. Chance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for the discussion. I did have just a question, and it's to Representative Scott's on, Mr. Palmer, during your testimony, you stated that there's still time to do the training. In the industry, is there discussion already, or is it something that has to be started possibly from this committee to say that, you know, where are we and what can you do to make it safe if this is coming forward?
I think we ought to just get a Dixie cup and 2 strings. We can communicate much better. Right now, there is no discussion, sir. The railroads, there's no requirement for them to go above and beyond. However, when you're looking at a 24-year shipping campaign, we've only got one shot to get it right. And we need to get it right. We need to do this in the right way. Currently, there is nothing that's going to keep a train from showing up somewhere in New Mexico at a crew change point and the most junior engineer and the most junior conductor running that train. If we need things to change, and we do, we're going to have to sit down with the carrier and come up with a way to train a smaller number of people to a much higher level. You can't train 100,000 employees and then track them with a radiation protection program. You don't need everybody trained. We need a small cadre of people at different spots trained to a higher standard, and then they can keep not only their own radiation levels lower, but they can make sure that the exposure to the public is much less. I remember in Oregon, the UP had a shipment of spent nuclear fuel, naval nuclear fuel, and they didn't have any crews to run it. Everybody was still sleeping. So they tied it down at the Amtrak depot. Now there's nothing to keep the railroads from doing that again. They don't have the culture to understand even the most basic safety concepts that we need to have instilled in them for a 24-year shipping campaign.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. I work for a construction industry or construction company here locally, and we've always looked forward on ways to prevent accidents or incidents. I guess I don't understand why the transportation industry has not, railroad, looked at this previously. You know, you talked earlier about the pregnant woman. You know, there's not any protections in there for that type of situation. I guess I would be looking forward to talking to you about who we would contact to get that discussion started, because I like the comment that you made that there is time and we need to get it right. We need to get it right the first time, so thank you so much. Mr. Gallegos.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to add the fact that the railroads have consistently been reactive. We proposed the positive train control, and the nation is way behind. BNSF is about 100% other than foreign railroads operating on our territory. The next thing the unions asked for, besides positive train control, is the electronic control brakes. And we've been fighting this on a national level since it's been introduced. But one of the requirements for these nuclear trains is that we have these electronic control brakes. And as Mr. Palmer stated, none of us have been trained on it.
These things are fantastic. They stop the train in way less than half the distance of air brakes. And we like to see them on every train, although it's a requirement for these nuclear trains or hauling nuclear waste. We're behind the Powerball. We need to talk. We've spoken with the FRA. They know our position. And these are the two things that we're fighting legislatively right now, is making sure all the railroads have positive train control and making sure we get these electronically controlled braking systems. So the unions are involved, but I guess because it costs a little bit of money to get these things done, they're a little bit behind. And I think eventually we'll get caught up, but we're many years from it right now.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gallegos, I went so far as to write the language for a national bargaining agreement that would provide radiation protection for all of the nation's railroads. And it was served on the carriers in a Section 6 notice last year. They did not choose to bring that up for discussion. And I think part of the reason is they don't understand the timelines that we're on. They're thinking that since Yucca Mountain is dead again, that they've got 15 or 20 years before anything starts moving. And that might not be the case. So I think they got taken by surprise in this. I have certainly been pushing the rope from my end, but I need somebody to pull from the other.
Mr. Palmer and Mr. Davis, thank you. Mr. Davis.
Yes,
Mr. Chairman and Representative Gallegos, I do have my alternate for my position. He's also our hazardous material trainer, union trained. This is not the company that's training us. He is offering his services to train not only firefighting, but local EMTs and fire departments to get the proper training for hazmat response for trains. Now, he's going to be going next month for the radiological training, and I'll be submitting some questions to that body to see exactly where they fit in as far as the protections that Mr. Palmer was speaking about. So I'm going to announce that we, in our community, SMART, will be offering this training to local entities. It's not his name. We'll get more information after next month, but we're planning to train the communities in this in the next few months.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Gallegos, if you would include me in on that, I'd like to follow up on that information.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, as soon as it's completed, I'll contact you and we'll get something set up here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Gallegos and Mr. Palmer. I guess my takeaway from this is the information's out there, the training's out there. We just need to be able to get the unions to be heard by the Federal Railroad Administration. So I like the idea that there's a timeline. We still have time to do it right, get it right first time. And with that, I'll yield. Thank you both. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to just pass the mic to, I think we go to Senator Carson.
Yes, please do. You're already there, Senator. Yes, I'll be next.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I just want to say I think of all the transportation of goods across this country, whether it's by rail or truck, air, I think that the railroads probably have the best record. Am I correct? And for that I appreciate it. It's because of the work that you all do and the safety that you exhibit in your work. Just a quick question, actually, just to call attention to a couple of pieces of documents that I asked Shauna to pass out because we don't have anyone from the NRC that is speaking publicly today, but I did find a couple of documents on the transportation of spent fuel and radioactive materials, and I hope the committee will take a few minutes to look through that short document. And then also online it's over a 500-page report on spent fuel transportation and the risk assessment that the NRC has done. And of course I didn't want to print 500 pages for everyone, but I did print the executive summary, which I think clearly explains many of the things we're talking about here. But I want to clarify, because it's my understanding in reading this document that basically it's the NRC that has the regulation over the safe transportation of nuclear products. And so they work with the DOT, but they're the ones who really do make the final rules and regulations and would have to approve any transportation regarding that. Am I correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kernan, it's my understanding that the NRC is more in the licensing business. License facilities, nuclear facilities, ISFACs, and the DOE, and I could be wrong, I quite often am, but I think the DOE is the one making the plans for the shipments. Every time we went to a tech meeting or an NTSF meeting, it was the DOE that was calling the shots. So if the NRC wants to jump in, it's just another acronym to me.
Okay, I'm on again. So basically the NRC does have responsibility for the transportation of any nuclear products throughout the country. So they are in fact the regulator on that. And I think that's why it's going to be important today for our committee to have that opportunity to visit with them, because clearly they have provided a pretty significant study on the safety issues. And one of the things that I read in this document from the NRC, doses from routine transport would be less than 1/1000 the amount of radiation people receive from background sources. So there are a lot of things in here that I think the NRC is going to be able to answer for us at the appropriate time. You know, we always tend as a legislature to kind of get the cart before the horse, and we get out there and we start doing things before we really have had a chance to let the process work. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to maybe getting some facts about who the real regulator is with regard to that. And I think just a question too is, as your union works with your employer, I would certainly think that you would have some influence over the things that we need to do. And obviously, you've talked about some of your concerns, and I think it's really important for the people that work for the railroads feel comfortable going forward. And I was pleased to hear you say that training is an opportunity to maybe alleviate some of the concerns and fears, and certainly there would be plenty of time to address that. But I do think the committee needs to understand where that authority is and where the responsibility is with regard to transportation of spent fuel and radioactive materials, and that clearly, in my opinion, based on the information I have here, rests with the NRC, which is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they are responsible. But I just want to thank you all, because I think it's really important for all of us to hear what your concerns are, and you certainly have worked nationally. I looked online at some of the things that you have done, and you certainly are very well respected across the country for the work that you do, and I really appreciate the fact that you've made time to come to New Mexico and share with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
See if this is going to work now.
It is, please. Shouldn't say anything. Maybe turn that one off.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Senator Kernan. All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Scott and Dan, for being with us today, and primarily thank you for your service to our country. It's great to see this type of expertise and caliber coming to meetings like this and educating us. This is what we need. We need to know everything that we can about this issue. As you said, very clearly indicated that the public doesn't know clearly all these little details that are in the whole spectrum, and that includes us as legislators. So we're happy to learn some more about this. But let me just ask something, and maybe this is more for Holtec later, Mr. Chairman, and if it is, I'll be happy to wait for a response for a little bit later. But I know the last time I was in the committee and we heard this item, the the analysis on that showed, much of that anyway, showed that this was for a 40-year period, and yet the casks are going to be stored for 120 years or so. Is this something that, I mean, are we testing the issue based on how we used to do things many years ago? Or how are we doing this? We should have a setup for the 120 years or more, not for 40 years, if in fact that's how long they're going to be there. So I'm pretty concerned about that. And I don't know if anyone can answer it now, Mr. Chairman. If not, we'll wait for Holtec later. What do you think, Mr. Chairman?
Sure, if Holtec is here and they'd like to give some responses, that's.
Okay, Holtec, somebody from Holtec maybe can answer that.
Or
They're not
perhaps
here.
you wanna wait
Okay, we can wait too until the end when we have others.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that now if you'd like.
Okay, sure.
All right, thank you.
Chairman, thank you. Senator, now I understand the syndrome here. My name is Joy Russell. I'm the Chief Communications Officer for Holtec. Thank you very much for that question. Ma'am, the process is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has issues a license for the facility for 40 years. That is the regulation. That is the process by which our application has been submitted and will be approved. If you look at the application, you can see that the design life of the dry storage system far exceeds that, and the service life far exceeds that. And the materials that we've selected indicate that the system performance exceeds 300 years. And as you were asking, ma'am, there are steps that must be taken throughout that licensing process called an aging management program. And that is stipulated by our license. So we will be following that throughout the timeline, and then through the 40-year license, and then when we apply for an extension of that license. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Now, if you turn yours off, I'll put mine back on. You can turn your mic off so mine can work. Thank you. Thank you, Joyce. Appreciate it. Okay, thank you very much. Now, let me ask you this. So what happens after, I'm trying to visualize this, okay? What happens after 40 years if you do not get a new license? With things changing at the federal government and, you know, administrations and so on, what happens if you don't get a license? What are you going to do with all the casks that are there? And do you have a plan for that, Mr. Chairman, Joyce? Joy, you said, or Joyce?
Mr. Chairman, ma'am, it's Joy.
Joy, thank you, Joy.
Competing mic. Ma'am, the process is that we will apply for a license. Spent nuclear fuel needs to be regulated, and as Madam, it is the requirement of the NRC to regulate spent nuclear material. So the process is that we will apply for a license and we will receive the license.
Turn yours off. Thank you, Joy. All right, well, I do have some concerns about that, but let me just go back and deviate a little bit from that question, Mr. Chairman. This goes for Scott, okay? Scott, and you gave us some very good education here. Thank you for that. But let me just ask this. You indicated earlier that you know, we don't fall under, if I wrote my notes correctly, under the radiation protections. We know that OSHA, you know, does not set limits pretty much on for radiation. Now, you spoke about pregnant women and so on. I guess the question that came to my mind when you mentioned that, and then that the radiation, there's more, give me a second, shipments allow for more radiation than a member of the public can receive, something to that effect. Thank you for that information. But that being said, when you were asked if adequate training would really make it safe for the transportation of the spent fuel, you said yes. And so I'm a little bit confused. Maybe you can help me, okay? I don't understand how training can help in the area when you don't fall under radiation protections by DOE. That's a federal policy. And then secondly, I don't understand how if we're allowing more radiation than a member of the public can receive, no training can help that. Radiation is just too high, obviously. So tell me a little bit about that. Help me understand this, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rodriguez.
You are absolutely right. Training is something that we have to have, and that will help people reduce their own radiation exposure, but it cannot be in place of a radiation protection program. We need dosimetry to measure how much radiation we were exposed to. I know when I was in the Navy, every millirem was accounted for. You couldn't even walk through a reactor compartment without being issued dosimetry. I know to the millirem what my lifetime exposure in the Navy was. So we have to have radiation protection program, and I should have said that before, and I apologize for that now. And we need training, because one without the other does not protect the workers. And if the workers don't know how to limit their own exposure, then they don't know how to do that with members of the public as well.
Could you respond to that as well?
Mr. Chair, Senator Rodriguez, maybe a point of clarification is that 10 CFR 20, which provides the radiological requirements, is divided into you're either a nuclear worker or you're a member of the public. 10 CFR Part 71, which regulates transportation, provides the dose limits from a rail car at certain distances. As the licensee of a transportation cask, our cask must have shielding to meet those requirements. So just a point of clarification that all members of the planet are either subject to dose limits as a nuclear worker or a non-nuclear worker. And indeed, the radiation protection programs will help the training.
If you want to disagree.
You mean training or the... Mr. Scott, were you going to say something on that before I go on? You can proceed. Thank you.
Mr.
Chairman Rodriguez, I think now,
Can you repeat it? Doesn't hear. You can't hear because I have mine on. Turn it off.
all right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, Senator Rodriguez, I disagree with the speaker. We're shipping radioactive material now without any dosimetry whatsoever. And as a member of the public, we're exposed to levels that exceed what a member of the public can receive. I mean, we're not a radiation worker, we are not a contractor, we are not members of the public, we are something completely different. We fall under OSHA, and OSHA does not require any kind of dosimetry unless your employer expects you to receive more than 312.5 millirem in a quarter. That is a huge amount to be exposed to. And any amount without dosimetry, the railroads are asking for problems. Because if they don't have dosimetry, anybody who's been exposed to one of these shipments is going to turn around and sue the railroads at some point when they get cancer, and the railroads won't be able to prove that they weren't exposed to high levels of radiation. Now, when my compatriot here has to go and knock off handbrakes on one of these spent nuclear fuel cars, he's going to be in at least a 40 millirem an hour field without dosimetry. Even though we're members of the public and can't be exposed to more than 2 millirem an hour, not to exceed 100 millirem per year, he's going to do this without any dosimetry to track how much exposure he actually has. So we've seen all kinds of nuclear shipments so far. I've talked to the engineers and crews on them. There have not a single one of them has had any training other than placard recognition, no special instructions, and no dosimetry to record their doses.
You turned yours off. There we go. Thank you, Scott. Thank you very much for that. You know, being that casks, as you said earlier, are tested, and I think Dan may have said this, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, are tested for 30 miles an hour. Is it Scott or Dan who mentioned it? And then they're allowed to go 50 miles an hour when they're actually just tested for 30. I guess the question that came to my mind is that we know that the core issue here is the potential radiation of a leak. That's, if we narrow everything down, that's exactly what it is. And based on that, I'm just wondering if someone can answer, do you test your casks in at least 2 different methods, in different ways? Or are they just tested by one way and the way it's always been done even many years ago? Who can answer that? Scott, thank you. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rodriguez, in that handout I gave, those 4 tests are the 4 tests required by the NRC to certify a cask design. The problem with it is that they don't actually do those to a cask. They can either do computer modeling or scale modeling to run those tests, but any kind of design has to pass all 4 of those tests consecutively in order to be certified.
Turn yours off. There we go. Thank you, Scott. Mr. Chairman, you know, I think that, you know, when you mentioned, Scott, that there was no, and I think I wrote your name on this one too, no radiation monitor in the locomotives. That to me is perplexing. I just can't imagine that you would not have that in the railroad transportation, especially when you have such great potential. This is a place where we cannot go with any type of potential for it to happen. This is a no-risk zone. It should be that way. And if we think that way, then it seems like we have quite a bit of work to do. Because, you know, I heard from both you and Dan, Mr. Chairman, Scott and Dan, that we're nowhere near, not near, the safety we need to transport this spent fuel. And based on the information that you presented, you know, where, my goodness, I can go on, and I don't want to take that much time, so I'm going to stop soon, Mr. Chairman, but I wrote several notes here. One of them was that basically we're too far to go to get help if the radiation leak happens. It says not 30 minutes away, Scott, you mentioned, but it's an hour to an hour and a half away before you can get some form of help. And I had read before, Mr. Chairman, in one of the papers or documents that I received or read, I don't know if it was newspaper or where, but I read it, that if a radiation leak happens and something happens to the cask, then the cask is going to be transported back to where, I guess it's where it came from. I mean, that could be a long way. What about the leaking radiation going through all the time while it's being transported? But I don't understand that. I mean, somebody help me with that. Scott, can you or somebody explain what happens when a leak does happen? I mean, what happens then with a cask? What are you going to do with a cask?
Chairman Steinborn, Senator Rodriguez, the leak that you're speaking of is the systems are canister-based systems. So if a canister exhibits a leak, it is then put into an overpack that doesn't leak. And that transportation overpack is what would be used to take it back to its facility of origin. Ma'am, I did not get an opportunity to continue to address, Mr. Chairman, if I could, Madam Rodriguez, the concept of how we license these transportation casks with those drop tests, the 4 tests in series that he was speaking of. I respectfully disagree that there is not a problem with doing simulations and physical testing. I have been at my company for 21 years and I have observed the physical testing, and I've also been involved in the simulations by computer. The nuclear industry is not unique in the use of simulations. We don't take an airplane out and crash it to see how it how it performs. We use simulations in that industry. Other industries, it's a common, accepted scientific practice, engineering practice, to use simulations. They're benchmarked against actual data from accidents and other, actual times when you go and perform a drop test and things. So we do use both. The entire industry uses both mechanisms. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator.
Awful. Thank you so much. And one more, Mr. Chairman, if I may make another comment or maybe ask a question, and then we can move on to defer to other members. And I think this was Dan who mentioned, Scott, I think, who mentioned that the DOE regulations indicate that as far as safety goes, the radiation limits, that it would be as well as reasonably achievable. And that's how you can, that's language, Scott, that is in there, that is how they're going to limit the potential radiation as well as reasonably achievable. Do I understand that correctly, Mr. Chairman, Scott?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rodriguez, the acronym is ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable. And it's a principle that the DOE adopts, and actually anyone who works in the nuclear industry adopts these practices, and they're actually very simple. They're things that you would do normally. If you've ever child-proofed your house, those are ALARA principles. You segregate the material, you keep access to it very securely guarded. People who don't need to be exposed to radiation aren't. If you're in a high radiation area, you're given a stay time and you've got to get back out. I mean, these are very simple ideas that the entire nuclear industry embraces, and you have to, because this is a special type of material. We haul a lot of bad stuff on the railroad, chlorine gas for one. And the difference between chlorine gas and spent nuclear fuel is chlorine can't hurt you while it's still in the tank car. Spent nuclear fuel can. And we all know that there's a slight risk of getting cancer from these shipments or any kind of other health things that radiation can do. But the ALARA principles are not part of the railroad lexicon. It's nothing that's taught. I know it because I was in the Navy. Don knows it because he was in the nuclear Navy, but it's a very simple process. Right now, if a train full of spent nuclear fuel pulled into any rail yard in New Mexico, the yardmaster who's going to tell him where to park that train doesn't have any training, so he could park it right next to the depot, or right next to the Amtrak depot, or right across the street from the kindergarten. They don't have any principles. They don't think like that because they haven't been trained to think like that.
For a second, Dan, thank you, Scott, for that. And Dan, you mentioned that the increase in the number of trains was going to be approximately 80, one half loaded and one half empty, roughly, okay? And I don't know if you said roughly, I'm putting that word in. But anyway, and that with all the track restrictions, it would be difficult to arrive to a certain destination within the time specified. Can you elaborate just a little bit on that for me? Where did this come from about the increase in trains by about 80? Is that something you figured out, or how do we know it's not 100 or 60, for example? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Projections that are made by BNSF Railway that give us an idea of how many people are going to be needed to work based on how many we have right now. We also include, who's going on vacation and everything else. So we discuss with the local union representatives, and we let them know how many, or the company will let us know how many more trains are going to be running. So our last projection between Carlsbad and Clovis is an increase of 80 trains total.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to leave it there, Mr. Chairman, just by concluding that based on not only the comments made today, but also what we know that there have been many more derailments in the last few years than there had been in the past, and considering all these concerns that have been expressed, not only by the two very well qualified engineers here, but with the experience that they have and so on. And I'm inclined to believe the information that has been submitted today, and I don't think that we are close to anything happening in the near future here. I would implore this committee to continue to do some more analysis and request more information. With that being said, Mr. Chairman, I have a question. Is the state department, or are the state departments anywhere here? I know this is a federal policy issue, but I believe that our state departments, Environment Department, Energy and Minerals Department, should be involved on behalf of the state of New Mexico to make sure that their best interests are in fact their best interests are being looked after by the federal government. Where are they today, Mr. Chairman?
As everyone knows, I have sent 2 letters now to the governor and to 6 state agencies asking almost 60 questions. All of the questions asked here today, and well more than that. I've gotten no response to any of those questions, regretfully. We've invited every single relevant cabinet secretary to come here today, from Homeland Security to the Secretary of Energy, for the second hearing now. None of them have taken the opportunity to come. It is kind of surprising, but that's the reality of the situation right now, is that we don't seem to have the state government actively engaged in this project.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that is quite sad, because as legislators, we look to our departments at the state level to get us the information we need, to be the experts in the areas that we need. That's why they're for certain departments. And I have a question. Did the secretary, I see him on the agenda for the Energy and Minerals Department, had he confirmed that he was going to be here, Mr. Chairman?
No.
No? Okay.
He confirmed he would not be here.
Oh, he did? Okay, so it's the other way around. Okay. All right. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to, and with that, I'm going to let others ask any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you guys for being here. It's interesting to see or discuss the issues that you bring forth, because they're important issues to the health and the safety of anybody who may be involved with the transportation of the material. But I did want to kind of ask Don, with just kind of a twinkle in my eye a little bit, is a projection the same as a simulation?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Griggs, nowhere near the same simulation projection. The projections are based on the economy, want, need, how many trains we're going to haul out of here, and empties we're going to haul into her. No, it's nowhere near a simulation.
Mr. Chairman, Don, I think when you're making analysis of things, they're very simple. But regardless of that particular point, the argument is how effective either one is. Whether the simulation, did we simulate it correctly? Did we meet the necessary criteria? And I believe that's what the NRC is supposed to do for this stuff, is to develop the criteria that would indicate whether or not it was safe or not, or as safe as you can make it, or whatever that sort of acronym was. But I want to ask Joy real quick too, because we're talking about the cask and the canisters, and we're talking about the safety to the people on the train that might, because I don't guess the decision's ultimately been made, Mr. Chair, to transport it by rail. But I believe that's most logical. But what do we believe will be the radioactivity outside is cask the outer cover? The outside of the cask. If we were standing, if you were the cask and I'm right here, how much radiation am I apt to be exposed to?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Griggs, thank you for allowing me to answer that question. Yes, the determination has been made to come by rail. These casks are very heavy, and therefore they are difficult to transport down the road. That doesn't mean we can't transport them in some fashion on multi-axle vehicles to get them to a railhead. So there may be some road up to a rail line. Now, addressing your question on the dose, 10 CFR Part 71 prescribes the specific dose rate on the outer package, as you said, sir, the cask itself, and then we have to have a personnel barrier over top of that, and there's a requirement for a dose at that personnel barrier, as well as a dose rate at a specific distance. There's also a requirement for a dose rate in the cab of a vehicle or in the locomotive. I apologize that I don't have those numbers memorized off the top of my head. They are in 10 CFR Part 71, and I know the specific distances and so on, but I don't know the limit. It's low, and it's in the realm of considered around a chest x-ray. That is what the NRC requires, because as these gentlemen have pointed out, as they pass through railroad crossings, as they pass through towns, the dose to the general public has to be below the 10 CFR 20 limits for the general public.
Which is?
I apologize that if I'm not answering your question completely.
What's
the dose?
Just real quickly. So the 10 CFR 20 is different from the 10 CFR 71, which that applies to the people that are in the process of transporting. Is that correct?
What's
It
the
says
dose?
NRC regulations for the safety of transport packages for large quantities of radioactive materials, including spent nuclear fuel, can be found in 10 CFR Part 71. There's our answer. And it's on the paper I handed out to everyone on the committee, but we need to, at some point, have a copy of that so we know what these gentlemen would be exposed to. But it's under 71, is that correct?
Chairman, Madam Kernan, yes, 10 CFR Part 71 provides those dose limits from the package.
Exactly.
Yes, ma'am. And then Part 20, to kind of bridge the gap there, Part 20 prescribes the dose limits to members of the public and to radiation workers.
So look, I would like a copy of it, and I'd like the chair to research, have this research, to get a copy for us of 10 CFR 20
Yes, ma'am.
and 10 CFR 71. We can go round and round today about whether they're going to be exposed or not. But until we see what the NRC requirements and regulations are, we're not going to know the answer to that question. So I would like copies of that, and then we will know an answer to that question, because the NRC regulates that dosage, not the DOT, not the DOE, it's the NRC. DOT is in collaboration with the NRC, but they have priority. The NRC works with the DOT, but it's the NRC that sets the rate, not the DOT, based on the information I've read. So, anyway, I just wanted clarification. We can get the answer to those. We need to get the answer to those, because we can sit here and pretend like we all know, but we don't until we see that written. Good night.
Senator Griggs, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that's kind of where we're headed a little bit with this, because I think what we're talking about, if you go to the letter that we received from UP, they talk about that they haven't received a request for transportation yet, so they are unwilling to comment yet, because they don't know what it is, I guess, that they're being asked to haul. So as that develops, I've got to believe if the railroad comes down, they know what these requirements will ultimately be if they're asked to haul it. And so the conversations with you guys will get then far more specific and in depth to make sure that, as you mentioned, Mr. Palmer, Mr. Chair, that, you know, if a guy's ultimately exposed to this stuff, some way, somehow, and sues the railroad, and the railroad doesn't want to be sued, so they're going to want to certainly work through you guys to be sure that the proper precautions are taken in order to ship whatever this is safely. And I've got to believe that, you know, the railroad and the unions both have a real interest in making that happen. So that, to me, as we look through these other stuff, it may just be, it may be, as we're talking about all this right now, it's just a matter of timing with what the decision's going to be by the NRC, if they're going to first of all grant Holtec's license. Then, as part of that, and some of those, I'm sure, comments that are being made to the NRC are directly related to transportation. So I think maybe we're just a little ahead, but it's great to be ahead. It's great to hear some of the things that are concerning to you guys, because we might not necessarily hear that, and it's good that we do. But I think that's kind of the questions that you're hearing, the comments that you're getting. Maybe they're going to be addressed in the actual CFR, and then you know, we'll have our answer. But that doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be procedures, railroad procedures especially, that make it more safe for you to haul the material. I had several things as I go bouncing around through each one of these pieces of paper that I have in front of me. But guys, I want you to know that I appreciate you being here. I appreciate learning your perspective, because it's all important. But I think maybe we're out there in front a little bit right now, trying to solve a problem that we don't necessarily have yet, but we may very shortly if the NRC grants the license to Holtec. Then the discussion's going to turn, and it's going to be will, can, and how does BP and Union Pacific, how do they transport the material safely in a way that protects the general public, and as equally as importantly, the people who are charged with hauling it and working to move it. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you guys very much.
You're welcome. Representative Cudlow, your neighbor.
I came in a little late, and so I'm representing Padre Colbert, District 44, Rio Rancho Corrales, and Town of Bernalillo. And in 1977, I worked for a company, and we spent 2.5 years doing research and working with the mines over toward Calab when yellow cake, uranium, was being shipped. And we worked very closely with a lot of the haulers, and we developed the training materials for a yellow cake accident. And we had to know the distances and understand what we developed suits, for lack of a better word, protection that the hauler, if it was trucking, you know, what they had to wear and everything, because the rail wasn't going out that far, you know, back in '77. So it was taken from the mines to a rail location, and because of the distance and where it was, anything could happen. And that was what our material was based on. And so, and I came in late, but in reviewing some of the material, after sitting and listening to everything, is there a request from anyone for the state of New Mexico, for us to start a ball rolling on some type of legislation, even though we already have, and I know it takes, 40 states or 39 states to put regulation in place, then the feds will take it and pass or do whatever they're going to do with it. So are you all requesting that from the state of New Mexico? Because I see you have, it says regulate users of radioactive material in 13 states. And so it's the user's end that's been regulated. Is there nothing, or did I miss something that on the other end that there's no regulation?
Is your question, Representative, are there regulations on the state end that we get to regulate a facility in our state? Is that your question?
No, my question is that I know that, there's federal regulations that's already in place. But I'm wondering if there is regulation that will go from state to state. That when it, or if there's any prohibition from it moving from state to state.
That would supersede or complement, or do the federal regulations, I would certainly assume absolutely, of course, affect us, if that's what you're talking about, in terms of the shipping, the storage, regulated activities that absolutely cover us. Now, the question that maybe you didn't ask, but I think is worth answering as well, about what role the state has, at least from this administration's standpoint, is indeterminate yet.
Mr. Chairman, and I was going to mention this maybe at the end of this discussion and maybe get some clarification with regard to what this committee and what the state of New Mexico's responsibility is at this point. And frankly, I think when I think about other businesses that come into the state of New Mexico to do business and the role of the state with regard to whether those companies can do business, and there are permits that are required to do business in the state of New Mexico. And at the point that that company, or the NRC in this case, makes a decision that Holtec would be the person who would receive that contract and do business in the state of New Mexico, it's at that point the state has a responsibility for water discharge permits, other permitting that's required by each individual department as it relates to the project. I remember when Urenco came into the state of New Mexico, the departments, they were not particularly active in the environmental impact statement process at this point. That's up to the communities. It's really not I think it's fine for this committee to be asking all of these questions, but at this point, it's up to the NRC to get responses from the community and then to try and make a decision whether, in fact, they would even consider the Holtec contract. At that point, I think it is up to the state of New Mexico to do due diligence, whether they can permit those parts that the state has responsibility over. And maybe we need some clarification from committee staff on what those permits would look like. But I think we are definitely getting ahead of ourselves. I don't mind this conversation. I think it's important. But I think to expect the state of New Mexico to all be here today to make responses on something that we are not even close to being at that point. And so I'm sure that the next administration would probably be the administration that will take a look at the permitting if Holtec in fact gets the contract. So let's just not get ahead of ourselves and worry too much. It's all in place. Urenco was a very smooth process. They received all the permits necessary. They were a private company, just like Holtec is. You know, when you think about what goes on in Los Alamos, we as a state don't tell Los Alamos what to do. That's the Department of Energy that does that. We don't tell Sandia what to do. That's the Department of Energy. So let's just take a deep breath. Let's let this process work. Let's see if we can get a result from the NRC on whether the impact statement is something they even want to do in New Mexico before we have all the departments jump in, and I don't know what we're asking them to do, so.
They have 2 years left before they want to start building it.
May I comment just real quick, as the one who's tried to elicit this, and then I'll allow Representative Brown, I wanted to also make it on that point. First of all, it's important to note that this committee under law, it's kind of unique from the other interim committees. We are actually required under law to monitor radioactive and hazardous materials in the state, issues, to monitor them, and including in that description of what we are tasked under law to do, includes emergency preparedness. So we are actually, it is incumbent on us to be ahead of the game. What's also important to know about this proposal is that we are in an active public comment period right now. The citizens of the state, this is not a theoretical thing. This proposal has basically been laid on the state and the citizens of the country to say, tell us what you think about this. So we're providing information, and that's really important. The other important thing I was going to wait to say that it's important to say right now, of course, about the state of New Mexico and our role is that this license for this facility with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission only applies to the facility itself. It does not include the transportation of the material to the facility. So I think it does not, and that's according to Holtec, at least at our last hearing, we asked them that question and they said it does not include the transportation of the facility. This application was just, is that correct, Joy?
Yes, that's correct. The application is for I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Indeed, sir, it is correct. The license application is for storage of spent nuclear fuel here in southeast New Mexico. Yes, sir. And not transportation, yes, Chairman.
I think it's important that we vet these issues out as a part of this proposal. So thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, and that's where I was going, is about the transportation. And I was focused on the transportation, not so much the licensing of the facility, but the transportation, the points, the start and the end, and what happens in between, and those folks who are in between. And I just a side note, I had an uncle who worked up at Los Alamos, and when there was not all these regulations, procedures in place, who died about 8, 9, maybe 10 years ago from a cancer that you can only get because of exposure. Okay, there's 7 cancers. And so, we have to be concerned. I know the senator said, well, we're way out there, let's not get out there before it. I think it's important to have this conversation. I think it's important to start really looking at what are the policies and procedures. And I notice in your handout, there's a statement that says any event involving NRC licensed materials, okay? It's on page 4. The second line says any event involving NRC licensed material that could threaten public health and safety or the environment would trigger special NRC procedures, okay? Is that those procedures that are at the facility that you're being licensed for? Or are those procedures at the beginning point and at the ending point? And with that, I'll relinquish the floor. Thank you.
Any of you want to answer that question?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Colbert, though I'm not sure which handout you're speaking of. Oh, very, very, very well, Senator Kernan. Ma'am, the procedures, the short answer is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulates the use of radioactive material, be it in a cardboard box or in a spent nuclear fuel cask. The NRC comes in and they inspect the procedures and the processes at the nuclear plant, which is the origin of the fuel. They will regulate the entire shipment. They will inspect the processes and procedures that are used from point A all the way to southeast New Mexico. You're absolutely right, Representative Colbert. Indeed, the NRC will review and oversee the entire process, including the procedures and the processes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
we're hitting the danger zone on the line.
Hopefully this will be pretty quick. It's just in their letter from Union Pacific, they say that as a common carrier, they're obligated to transport hazardous material by federal law. So I just wanted to, that's what they say. So in the event the license is granted and the decision to go by rail, then it looks like they're going to be obligated to take it. Then the decisions get made on how to take it, I suppose, or discussion with you guys and all that to be sure the safety requirements for you and others are met. So that's my comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Padrell, Colbert, and Senator Griggs, yes, we have preemptive legislation here in New Mexico. I proposed a two-man crew bill, which I couldn't get it through committee. I couldn't even get it to committee, the Corporation Transportation Committee. This two-man bill would ensure that we have adequate people, instead of just being an engineer-only railroad, that we would have that conductor sitting next to us to help us out. Now, since this has come to light, I will, next time I propose this piece of legislation, I will be adding to that we have 3 people when we're having this particular material being hauled. And Representative Padrell, Colbert, I do know exactly where you're talking about there north of Milan. There used to be a rail spur coming off the main track. It's now been removed. And the rail workers that hauled that yellow cake had no idea what they were hauling or the effects on their body, including the mine workers. So we're in that conundrum there, and Smart Transportation Division will not go down that road. We're going to do all we can to prevent those instances, and I can assure you that legislation that Smart will be producing will also consider those things.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Griggs, I'll keep these very brief. I know time is not our friend here. I look at radiation protection from a national overarching perspective, not just New Mexico. But the fact remains that we're handling radioactive material now without any protections. And I don't see how it would comfort us to think, well, one day when we get into a bigger shipping campaign, the railroads might throw us a bone. They should have had these protections 40 years ago, and they just don't.
Mr. Chair, I guess some of that, would you look at the requirements that are already published? Are they sufficient or not? Maybe they are, maybe not. But
Can't hear.
I appreciate the comment.
Very good. Okay. Representative Sariano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think it's mostly for you on the tracks. So we have tracks that are not in the best shape in New Mexico, correct?
No.
Okay. You're looking at sending 10,000 casks being hauled, right? Around 10,000. You said it's a very heavy load. And what can our tracks hold? I was told that track rating is 143 tons per rail car, and the load was going to be 210 tons per rail car.
The track conditions in New Mexico are pretty good. We have the Transcon that runs from Los Angeles to Chicago. We run 70-mile-an-hour trains across it, but the conditions between Carlsbad and Clovis are in question. We have all these restrictions and everything, and they do run oil trains through there. Specifically, we would want an improvement on those tracks. I'm almost sure that they wouldn't allow this waste to come over these tracks because of their current conditions. The weight limit is 143 tons per car, bridges and tracks, but the vessel that sits on a uniquely designed rail car has more than 4 axles. That's normally what we're talking to, is a 4-axle car. This has 12 axles, so uniquely spreads out the weight to allow for the limitations of the tracks. Okay, but when it comes to speed and the curves in the track, I'm not very confident that these tracks, without improvement, will be able to do this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and panel. Appreciate you all being here. It's been a very interesting discussion. The question I have is, and I have actually a report here, it was published about 6 months ago. It's management of nuclear spent fuel, and it was put out by the U.S. Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. And I wish every member of the committee could have a copy of this. Maybe it's possible to track down copies for everybody, but there's a lot of good information in here that basically sets out the jurisdictions, who's responsible for what. And this is pretty much a federal process at this point, and this committee does have an oversight role, of course, and we take it very seriously. But what I'd like to see is some kind of a memo requested by this committee, prepared by the committee staff, indicating what New Mexico agencies have any kind of jurisdiction or regulatory effect on nuclear activities. Is it the New Mexico Environment Department? Is it the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department? Is it New Mexico Department of Transportation, or any other? I'd like to see something in writing that tells us what the agency's bailiwick is over nuclear. And certainly it's a federal issue, I think we all recognize that, but is there something there that points to the states? And if so, I'd like some statutory citations to give us something we can refer to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, if I can ask you, are you familiar with the scale of this project, how many casks are involved and how many shipments are involved? Scott?
Mr. Chairman, roughly I am. I heard the number 10,000 casks, but the number of metric tons of heavy metal that they applied for exceeds that of the original Yucca Mountain environmental impact statement. So it's basically everything that would have gone to Yucca Mountain and then a little bit more.
Are we talking about all of the existing spent nuclear fuel in the entire country that exists right now? The capacity of this facility could handle it. Would that be correct?
Mr. Chairman, indeed, that's correct. The license application currently asks for the first 500 casks, but the environmental impact statement looks at the full 10,000 casks, which is 173,000 metric tons. So it's current inventory plus the projection for end of plant life for most of the nuclear plants. Thank you, sir.
How many of these casks, if you hang on to the mic, how many of these casks has your company produced so far?
She hasn't read it.
You can, I think, leave your mic on.
Leave it on, sir?
I think you can.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, my company has, we currently have 1,100 systems loaded around the world, most of those in the United States. 90% of those are in the United States. My company manufactures all of the equipment that we supply at our 3 factories. We have 1 factory in Ohio, 1 factory in Pittsburgh, 1 factory in Camden, New Jersey. Because we are continuously producing these, we've manufactured nearly 1,700 of these dry storage systems, including the transportation casks. Thank you, sir.
The ones being proposed for New Mexico, how old is the oldest one in existence that you have produced?
Mr. Chairman, the canister itself that's proposed to be used in New Mexico, the oldest one was loaded in the year 2000.
So when we talk about the difference between a projection and we talk about a 300-year projected lifespan, the reality is the experiential history with these designs is the oldest one in existence is 17 years old. And this is for a 40-year license, so understand that the license itself is beyond the experience that exists. Important to know. Ma'am, in San Onofre recently, were there problems with these casks, or one of them that had to be returned?
Mr. Chairman, I believe you're referring to an issue with a shim pin that we're talking about. Indeed, there was what we call foreign material found in the bottom of one of the canisters, and it was determined that on one of the canisters, one of these small pins had broken off. And indeed, we rectified the situation by replacing the shim. There was no degradation on the performance of the system, but there was foreign material found in the canister.
Okay. And my understanding is an assessment is still being done to assess the outcome of the breach or the malfunction, and then also Holtec is replacing that canister with a previously designed canister. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that's not exactly correct. We have, there was no malfunction with the system. One of the pins broke off, which led to foreign material. We did, and we have actually concluded the investigation, and to prevent these pieces from breaking off in the future, we've reverted to the previous shim design. So the canister itself, there's no malfunction. The design was acceptable. The design of the shims was also acceptable. We've determined that because the risk for the shim to be broken off, that we would just revert to the previous shim design. So in that regard, yes, the shim design has been reverted to, and the canisters have now were sent back to one of our factories, either Pittsburgh or in Camden, and we replaced the shims on the baskets. But the canisters themselves are still acceptable. Thank you, sir.
So I could go deeper into the whole shim issue because it's kind of fascinating, because I understand they basically allow for an element to cool the fuel on the inside, and those shims allow for the placement of the rods and then some sort of other material that cools the fuel. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, the shim is a piece that is in the exterior of the canister. If I could draw this. The canister itself is circular, and there's a basket inside that looks like an egg crate. Exterior to that egg crate, in an area between where the fuel is stored and the canister, is an aluminum shim. And at the bottom of that shim, it has to be elevated approximately 3 inches so that the helium, as you said, has to be able to circulate. So there are many shims around the exterior of this basket. In this case, one of the pins broke off. There are 3 pins at the bottom of each shim. So the shim didn't even come down and lose its contact, and come in contact with the bottom of the canister. It still remained elevated. So it doesn't actually impact the spent fuel proper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sorry, I just want to keep things moving because I got a number of other questions. How many rail shipments has Holtec directly contracted for of your canisters total in the country?
Mr. Chairman, Holtec International, we do not actually do the shipments. We have a company called Edlo International, which does shipments of spent nuclear fuel in the United States and around the world. They are our shipping partner. Thank you, sir.
How many shipments totally have occurred? Do you know, with your canisters that you total?
Yes, sir. Our canisters have not been shipped.
Okay. So I guess I'm trying to make a point here, which is that the number of canisters that are going to be proposed for this site are literally a magnitude of maybe not quite 10, but a significant greater number than your company has produced. Correct? That's just a fact. We're talking about producing 10,000 canisters, right? For this proposal.
Mr. Chairman, our application is to accept not only our own canisters, but the canisters of our competitors, which is how the entire population of spent fuel is what we're looking at, sir. Okay. Indeed. Thank you, sir.
Fair enough. Gentlemen, the number of rail shipments, the reason I was asking that question, and I think you spoke to this with Yucca Mountain, or maybe you spoke to it, Don, what's being contemplated in terms of the volume of rail shipping into this state would dramatically exceed what has happened in our country. Maybe, I mean, I don't know how you would quantify that, but is it fair to say that this is a dramatic increase of a scale that's just of a magnitude order than what our country has experienced with shipping nuclear
fuel?
Mr. Chairman, as far as I can determine, this is historic in all proportions. I don't believe there's been a shipping campaign like this in the world. And we are going to be on the leading edge of it. A lot of the other countries ship their waste right now regularly. We do not. It's all been sitting pretty much where it's been generated, and this is historic.
Okay, and I want to read to you, I looked up Google while we were talking about jurisdictions and whatnot, and I went to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and I looked up the transportation of nuclear fuel, and there's a quote on there that I want to read for everybody. And they talk about how they try to limit exposure, and we understand, we can all acknowledge things are designed to be safe. Mistakes happen. And the quote on the NRC website is, quote, "There is no way to completely eliminate risk." And so, as we consider this proposal and we consider it as New Mexico, the members of this committee, I think it's important for us to look at things, what happens when that 1% accident rate, or whatever that percent is, what happens when that day comes? We've seen that day with WIP. And then it's a question of, well, is this risk acceptable to us all? But we have to acknowledge that it exists. There's lots of issues that have to be considered that are not part of this application, but that are upon us right now. This application, according to Holtec, could be wrapped up within 2 years. They could start construction within 3 years, as I understand it. And yet, this application does not consider transportation, doesn't consider emergency preparedness in communities if an accident occurs. And then there's just a number of other issues that frankly are our concern. If you look at our last committee hearing, we had a map, thank you for Holtec for the presentation, of the rail lines. It comes in through all corners of the state. If an accident were to occur near Las Cruces, every bit of it will come from Clovis through Roswell. That's going to be a busy spur. I mean, they're going to have this shipments going by, who knows, weekly, daily. But ma'am, has Holtec had any conversations with any communities in New Mexico about emergency preparedness?
Tried to, we weren't invited.
Mr. Chairman, we have had communications with communities both in Lee County and Eddy County. Yes, sir.
But not along rail routes at this point.
Mr. Chairman, not at this point. No, sir.
So my concern, colleagues, is that I think these are all questions that should be answered up front as we move forward with these proposals. In this way, I think these questions are very timely, this discussion's timely. I encourage the executive, regardless of whether legal authority is, to engage in it, because it's simply not in the NRC's purview at this moment. Anyway, so thank you for allowing me those questions. Representative Scott, do you have an on that point? Otherwise, I have someone in front of you. Okay. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On that point, I have information here that there have been some 1,300 commercial fuel shipments in the United States and more than 850 naval fuel shipments without either incident or release.
And the waste coming out is 1 million tons of radioactive.
Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is 1 million tons of radioactive.
When it comes out. This is when it goes in.
Very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go to Joy, okay, for a moment, Joy. You mentioned earlier that when I asked about the second method of testing casks and so on, if there was any second method, you mentioned that the second cast cover does not leak. There's two, if you call them covers, I don't remember what you called it, but it's a cover to me. I'm looking at a different capsule above the other one, okay? And you said it doesn't leak. Well, let me ask you this question, Joy. The shim that you talked about when our chairman asked you about any problems, you said that yes, that there was it was a shim that broke off the canister. Now let me ask you this, you didn't anticipate that break, obviously, and so it happened anyway. And the question that I have is, you're not anticipating a leak from that second capsule that's supposed to be the second cover. But based on just the first one alone, there's potential for it to leak then. Anything can happen.
as the chairman mentioned a moment ago, there's no, and the quote that he read, there's no risk, if I got it correctly, Mr. Chairman, there's no risk that can be totally eliminated. So how can you guarantee that that second capsule that is going to cover that first one to ensure that there's no leaks is ever going to remain that way and that there will never be a leak? How can you guarantee that, Joy, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rodriguez, I understand your question, ma'am. If you step back and understand what spent nuclear fuel is, ma'am, if I may, this is a spent nuclear fuel pellet. It's a ceramic pellet. Spent nuclear fuel is made up of ceramic pellets in stainless steel rods, or they're zircaloy rods, excuse me, that are seal welded. Then so that is the first barrier to prevent a leak, because when you think leak, you're probably thinking liquid. Spent nuclear fuel is not a liquid. This pellet is the first line of defense. The second line of defense is the actual fuel rod. If the canister, which is the third line of defense, leaks, we put it into another overpack. That overpack is designed, manufactured to the highest levels of quality, and it's been analyzed and demonstrated both by simulation and by testing that even under the most severe accident scenarios, it can't leak. If it's hit by a missile, if you were to look on our website, you can see we've actually blasted missiles into our transportation casks, and they don't leak. So if you think through that whole concept, these things are virtually indestructible. And if you look at the contents that we're carrying, there isn't anything to leak, because spent nuclear fuel is a solid material.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, yes, and forgive my Mr. Chairman, Madam Rodriguez.
Thank you, Joy, for that information. And I understand maybe the word leak may have been used incorrectly because it's not a liquid, but it does emanate radiation. So however you want to put it, maybe in the right grammar, whatever it may be, it's something that comes out of a canister if it would happen. Okay, and so it does impact people quite, tremendously, actually. That's an understatement. But either way, I guess I look back at that shim that we're talking about. And that was obviously something that was not supposed to break off either. So in the simulation that you did, whatever and however you do it, it was something that you would have never imagined would have come off, but yet it did. And so I guess, Mr. Chairman, what I'm saying is that I go back to my last comment earlier that there's so much work to do to continue to look at this, and there's so much more comprehensive groups, more knowledge, more things that we need to get ourselves from the departments of the state. And I agree with you, and with Representative Brown, that we are an oversight committee, and we do have to have our resources here to continue to help us, our departments. And we just need to follow up very meticulously on this. This is not something, as I said earlier, it's really, I called it a no-risk zone. I mean entirely no risk, and there isn't anything like that. So can we actually have something that someone can guarantee this? Obviously not. And I think the impact is far too great to put up something that may or may not leak. I just can't see that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I just have one final question I meant to ask you before. So with the historic proportions of this rail shipment project and bringing all this waste in, and the issues involved in weight and infrastructure, and as that would relate to worker safety if something were to go wrong, And I think you both spoke to how much time and preparation should be involved in training workers and providing the right equipment and making sure that we are prepared on this scale to protect people, to protect communities, just in terms of handling it. Would you advise that the state of New Mexico take a rigorous evaluation of rail safety and worker safety prior to supporting this, or that we should withhold support of this project until it has been determined that we're ready to have that happen?
Speaking on the transportation side, we're at historic proportions right now. All they used to haul out of this area was out of the mines, taconite and whatnot. And with the oil boom, current oil boom, we're bringing a lot of oil trains out of here and a lot of sand trains in this area. So we're pretty close to capacity right now. We're just manning this area has been difficult for us because we're hiring people in Belen and Clovis and forcing them to come down Carlsbad. And of course they're looking for housing and everything else. So we're at maximum capacity right now. I would recommend that until the transportation side, the rail side, considers moving these casks, that it is greatly improved. And this could take years.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From an overarching perspective, and obviously I'm from Oregon and not New Mexico, I would consider it to be a wise course of action to withhold support until some issues are cleared up. Even in the environmental impact statement for Yucca Mountain, they said 3 to 8 transportation workers would die from cancer as a direct result of these shipments, and that is an incident-free transportation. So this is going to take a toll on people. Now, if we have training and if we have dosimetry, which we didn't in that EIS, those numbers can be much, much lower. So considering that it is the people of your state and tribal members who are running these trains and inspecting the cars and working on the tracks, yeah, I would say it would be wise to withhold support until some training and we've hammered out the dosimetry issues required.
Thank you. Yes. Did you want to make it on that point?
On that point, this is a business deal. Am I correct? Mm-hmm. Okay, this is a private business deal. And so I guess my concern is safety from point A to point B, okay? But at the end of the day, this is a business deal. And I have some concerns that New Mexico would come in and step in the middle of a business deal that's being held up for 8 or 9 years. I mean, I really have some issues with that. I think that probably, Mr. Scott? Okay, that probably with your experience, there's enough knowledge out there to be able to mitigate some of the concerns that we have, okay, and address those concerns. But as a person who is involved in business, with businesses in my district all the time, you know, I have some major concerns that New Mexico would come in and interfere with a business deal. You know, and I just put that out there, that that's something that we have to take in consideration. I mean, at the end of the day, what right do you have to come in and tell me I can't open my business if I have met all the regulations that's required? And so that's just, on that point, I do have some concerns.
And I think when you consider things like the Gold King mine spill, when you consider the sinkhole in Carlsbad, and you consider things caused by industry and maybe too lax of oversight, believe me, it's in those moments where people go, why didn't government look out for us? So, I mean, clearly we have regulation to protect people. It's a balancing act, but that would be a little bit of an answer. But just final question. So because of the speed of rail, of how slow this material has to be shipped and the vast quantity of it, I guess what I'm wondering is if a logical rail route of shipping a container into its end destination, proposed end destination here near Hobbs, is backed up, would a rail, as a matter of business, route that in maybe a completely different direction, maybe bring it in around a different state, through the other side of the state, just to keep parking?
That has been discussed at these various DOE meetings, and yes, the railroad has the right to use different routing. Particularly, there might be an outage on one line that go a different way. That's kind of a two-edged sword. Part of the DOE likes going on the little backyard railroad routes that keep them out of the major cities. But with that, you've got to remember the first responders are going to be the volunteer fire departments or tribal authorities if it happens on tribal land, who might not have the training and equipment to respond. So do you use the routes that go through the cities that have that kind of first response, and then you put jeopardy? So yeah, they can go any way they want. They're in it to make, it's a business to them, so whatever gets there quickest is going to make the most sense for the carriers.
Thank you very much. Committee, anything else?
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Okay, excuse me, we'll let Senator Martinez now come to you, represent. Senator Martinez.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to state that I totally agree with Representative Padral Colbert, and that's unusual because we don't always agree, but I agree with her. I think that this has been vetted. It is a business deal, and the quote that you indicated, that there's no way to eliminate any kind of risk, well, that goes in life in general. There's no way to say that a plane's engine isn't going to give out in the middle of the ocean, and a train isn't going to hit a sitting vehicle on the tracks. I mean, those are just risks that we take in life in general, and I think that the storage of these fuel storage system is one of the most secure and safety technology licensed by the USNRC. The canisters that are being used are very good canisters. I mean, we've seen what has happened, and sure, we've had some issues at the website, but those are issues that we're going to have in life in general. I mean, those are just going to happen, and I think that we shouldn't stand in the way of something that this community and surrounding communities are going to benefit from, and they probably want. So I think that we should be a little more supportive rather than trying to block progress with this organization. So that's just my spill and my opinion, and I can have my opinion and say whatever I want. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We shouldn't keep saying nothing's ever going to happen if risks are likely in life. Don't make promises then.
Representative Scott.
And of what magnitude? Stubbing your toe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My comments would speak to the conversation around risk. General aviation has 2 fatalities per 100,000 flight hours. There are roughly 35 to 40,000 fatalities on the roads and highways in this country every year. Now, a good place to start with the evaluation of spent fuel transportation risk looks to me like would be this NRC report that studied this issue specifically in 2014. And the one statistic here that really jumps out at me is there is less than a 1 in 1 billion chance that radioactive material would be released in an accident. And that, to me, in a mechanized society that we live in, is as close to no risk as we can get. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Then why do we need to move it?
Until it happens.
Okay, y'all, thank you for the very good discussion. We appreciate it, and thank you for flying a long way to be with us today, Scott. And by all means, ma'am, if we need you to come back up, we'll invite you to come back up so you can continue to represent. Well, thank you all.
Mr. Chairman, if I may apologize because I called Dawn Dan.
As having a twin brother named Dan, that was a compliment, but you know. All right, we'll move on to the next panel. Lorenzo Velasquez, the Director of Emergency Management for Lee County, and Jennifer Armendariz, the Emergency Manager with Eddy County. Are you both here?
I'm here.
Okay, great. Is Jennifer here?
She's here.
Great. Y'all have a seat here and go ahead and get started. Of course, on this panel, we did invite Jay Mitchell, the Secretary of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, to talk, and he declined to come. Committee, do y'all need a 2-minute break, or can we just keep rolling? We'll keep rolling. Okay. The media has said they would like a break.
Yeah, break.
All right. So we'll keep rolling. Lorenzo Velasquez, Director of Emergency Management for Lee County. Why don't you start first, introduce yourself, and then we'll give you the floor, and we'll probably have each of you make a little presentation, and then we'll start asking some questions. Thank you, Lorenzo.
One, two. Okay, good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee members. I'm Lorenzo Velasquez. I'm the Emergency Management Director for Lee County, New Mexico. I've been in this position for 32 years. Prior to that, I was 21 years as a law enforcement officer. So I have a lot of background in first response. What I'd like to cover very quickly, and this is what I was asked to bring up, is what our role and what we do in Lee County. I'm proud to say that since 2000, I only went 5 years. Since 2013 to date, we've had 59 training exercises to include oil, Urenco, WHIP, Targa, several companies, several organizations. We have a good relationship with all companies that come into Lee County. They all want to participate. They all would like all of our first responders to be trained in responses to the companies in any type of incident. We just finished one last week. I just finished a tabletop yesterday. We've got another one coming up next week. So we're always doing training because it's better. It's better to find the flaws now than when it actually happens. So that's where we stand there. Another thing that I was asked to bring up real quickly is how much funding we've received in federal funding through Homeland Security. I'm proud to say Lee County has received what's on the first page? $6.4 million for all of our first responders. That's pretty good. We get from emergency warning systems, we get it to SCBAs for our fire departments, our hazmat team that we have here currently that responds to any type of hazmat incident. They're fully equipped. They have everything. And Homeland Security also pays for their training. So there's lots of training here. We're proud of that. We have the support of our commissioners, city and county. And that's why we're at now. The other part is we're not afraid to ask for help. A couple years ago, we did have a flood in this area. You can imagine that. The county commission signed a disaster declaration. The governor signed it. We received $3.2 million in funding to repair our roads. So we work great with the states, with the representatives, and we get a lot of support down there because it's very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Senator, I don't like being after Lorenzo because I cannot compare to him ever. But I have been with the Office of Emergency Management for Eddy County for 7 years now. And I was given some of the questions as well to prepare for as far as emergency preparedness for Eddy County. And so I brought Chief Lopez with the Carlsbad Fire Department as well because we work very closely with all our agencies in Eddy County. As far as funding, when Lorenzo does allow some money to be left over, we do go after that as well. He tends to get it a lot faster than we do, but we do receive funding as well. There's grants out there that we applied for, and FEMA funding as well. We had some flooding as well in 2013 and 2014. We did receive FEMA funding for that, for road repair, which is still going on. And it seems like it's hard to catch up with. As far as Holtec reaching out, that was one of the questions that we were addressed. We did have a group from Holtec come to us and talk to us about emergency preparedness and about what their plans were for the future. We had a conference call shortly after that, maybe a couple of weeks after that, and they assured us that they would, address any issues that came up and give us any plans that they had moving forward. So yes, we did have an outreach from Holtec. One of the other questions was, how are we prepared? We have interagency exercises, tabletops. We focus a lot on, right now our focus in Eddy County is obviously the sinkhole. So we've had some tabletop exercises on that. We have several meetings on that every other month. And a lot of oil field response as well. We work very closely with oil field companies in our area, holding tabletop exercises, going over their emergency operations plans, and whatever else may come up that they want to address. Chief Lopez and I actually sat together and went over a couple of these questions, so I'll ask if you have anything that you want to add to that.
Chief.
Good morning, Richard Lopez, the Carlsbad Fire Department Chief with the department for 15 years. We reviewed over these questions, and as far as preparedness is concerned, there was a lot of talk of a potential accident. Well, that's why they're called accidents. I don't think you can always, or for sure, eliminate every risk. My concern, though, is not radioactive release. That is not my concern with what I've reviewed, what has been given to me. I'm comfortable with WHIP, and I believe I'll be comfortable with Holtec and the plan that is moving forward as far as that is concerned. Managing risk from day to day is kind of my job. That's what I live for. So we deal with this all the time, and I don't have any concerns as far as radiological release from the information that has been given to me. Obviously, we'll continue to review it. I do have concerns with the actual rail. That I don't believe is ironclad as far as a process, because that obviously, from what I'm seeing here, is not in front of us. The site itself, I'm satisfied with what I've been presented. I would like to see more on the transportation side, but it doesn't sound like that's what we're here to discuss. So that's where I would have the concern. Now, this being in Lee County, I would be secondary as far as getting called into anything at the actual site. So I would like to move forward and look at the transportation side of things on my end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And really, again,
The reason we wanted you all to come is because people in the state, aside from the folks that have experience with nuclear materials, and wanted to hear your experience working with, so that we could learn more about what kinds of outreach we should see in other communities. So, thank you. So let's go on to the list, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions for you. Representative Gallegos.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and thank you, Lorenzo and Jennifer and Chief Lopez. I had a question, just because Lorenzo brought up that we do a lot of training here in Lee County, and I was wondering if you've done anything with the rail systems.
No, we have not.
But part of that thought is just if they would be responsive to that. I work for Ramirez and Sons, and a few years back we had a derailment outside of Artesia, and we rebuilt the subgrade there. And in that, it was just salt. Trying to think through they were talking about the line from Carlsbad to Clovis. And there again, I don't know a rail system. I actually wish I'd thought about this earlier, talked to Mr. Gallegos and Mr. Palmer. We were told that the casket was similar in weight as a locomotive, and the failure on that site was subgrade. I mean, they had a culvert that went underneath it that rotted out, and but I was just wondering, because of seeing that derailment there, if it wouldn't be good to get with the rail system and ask them, not to actually have an accident, but what we would do and how we would respond with their personnel. We had some issues with, it was an insurance group that works for the rail system, that their view of construction was different than ours, so we had a few glitches in that. But going back to Lorenzo's testimonies, it's better to do it now than later. So I just thought I'd bring that up because I did get to see that derailment in Artesia. And to me, that's the weakest link right now, from what I can see, is from Carlsbad to Clovis. So I just thought I'd throw that out there for consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this is for Lorenzo as well. And I think most of us in the room are aware that there are two applications for the NRC, one from Holtec, which would be in Lee County. The second one is from WCS, which is basically right on the New Mexico state line. So should they receive that, if they are granted the contract and that is cited there, and there is an issue, what would be the responsibility of Lee County? Would you respond or be a part of that response?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, we would, because we do work closely with the surrounding Texas counties. Whenever we need assistance, they come to us, and whenever they need assistance, we go to them. So in that aspect, with WCS, yes, we would be involved, especially if it's coming through the railway. Because if it's coming through the railway, it's going to come from 18 east and then go into WCS.
So I think I'm speaking more just in terms of on site particularly, and that is something that I think we need to consider as we continue, because if a contract is granted, I certainly would prefer that be in New Mexico rather than on the New Mexico border, where we have all the risk and we have no benefit at all.
Exactly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and panelists. Thank you for being here. It's good to see all of you. We've had a lot of discussion in the public hearings that have been held to date about the potential for something to go wrong. And some people think the mere potential ought to shut down any idea. And I just want to talk about that for a little bit and get your perspective as emergency managers. It seems to me that, it's been said, and everybody starts with the point that there's nothing in life that has zero risk. That's just the reality of it. But we find ways to manage risk and to make things as safe as we possibly can. And I think the nuclear field is probably the #1 example of designing beyond what some people would say are even needed restriction of whatever. The standards are so incredibly high. I remember my husband works for the Department of Energy at WIB, and a few years ago we were going to build a rock wall in our backyard, or a cinder block wall, and he designed it, and the cost was going to be exorbitant. It was like, why is it so much? Because he built it to nuclear standards, because that's what he does. And I think most people in the public do not understand nuclear facilities at all and how robust they are.
Last week, I was in Georgia touring the 2 nuclear power plants that are currently under construction. And our whole group is legislators from around the country, and we marveled at the design work, the engineering, the precautions that are taken. People have no idea, unless they've been in that industry themselves, how careful we really are. So I want to talk about risk a little bit, and it seems to me if people are concerned about radiation, well then they need to find a way to shut off the sun. And they should never live in a brick house. They shouldn't eat potato chips because those bags they come in have a little bit of radioactive whatever in them. But it's not dangerous, and that's the point that I'm trying to make. Radioactivity exists. It's part of being on this planet. And if people are worried about radioactivity, we need to at least quantify and remind ourselves there are safe limits to things. And that's what your jobs, I think, are when you're talking about anything that might be coming through your county's radioactive shipment. And then finally, too, don't get sick and never go to a hospital because there are radioactive sources in those buildings. So it's all about being, I think, about common sense. So my understanding of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and I've been kind of paying attention now for a while, is that it's a really tough government agency to get anything approved by. They're very, very strict about things. So I think that is good for people to understand. But I want to know now from your perspective in emergency management, when you talk about risk in your jobs and with your teams of people, what are your thoughts on that? If you don't mind, whoever wants to answer.
When I first started in this emergency management world, the first thing that I was told was always remember to plan for the worst and hope for the best. So we've kind of lived by that. We do exactly that. We take on the tabletop exercises, we put different scenarios where what might happen or what could happen. So when, and some of them are way out there, some of them you think, why would you ever even think of that? But just in case, and because you never know. So that's, living by that, that's what we do. We plan for the worst and we hope for the best, and then we react to what what comes before us, what emergency comes before us, and we respond.
Mr. Chair, Committee, Representative Brown, you're correct. The risk is minimal in my mind, and I believe you would get more from an X-ray when you go to the dentist than you will if something were to, one of the 4 layers would fail in this casket. So day in and day out, it's risk versus benefit. Yesterday we had train versus 18-wheeler. We had tank battery explode, and we worked a structure fire all before 4 p.m. So the risk is out there in many different areas that is a lot higher in my opinion. So this with, again, what I've been reviewing is as safe as we're going to get, and it is probably the best way to deal with this spent fuel. I feel that we have higher risk in everything else we're doing, and we constantly monitor that to prepare for it. I look at social media to see who else is dealing with what, and then we build a plan with that. So when you have the 50-year flood and the 100-year flood back to back, and then Goliath right after that, we have a lot on our plate. And Holtec is not as high of a concern as some of the other things I'm dealing with day to day. Thank you.
Senator Martinez, you had it on that point.
Yes, sir. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Brown. I just wanted to, when she mentioned don't go to the doctor, don't eat potato chips, don't get old either, because the older you get, the more risks you have. In 2015, I broke my foot climbing stairs. I went and I had surgery at the Espanola Hospital, and I developed a staph infection. And because of the infection, I had to remain in a soft cast. And because of that soft cast, I couldn't put any pressure on it. So I was in a wheelchair for 6 months. And then I started using the riding cycle for about another couple of months. So the reality is that you have to be very careful, because anything is a risk in life. And that's the bottom line. And I think that that's why we have individuals like you guys that are preparing for this incidence of this situation. And the way my doctor told me, from now on, Senator Martinez, you walk with a purpose. You look down and you make sure that you don't walk on any rocks or any stones or anything like that, so that you don't fall and break that foot again. Or I've got a 4-inch metal with 7 screws or 8 screws in my foot. So I've got to walk with a purpose. So I agree with what Representative Brown said, and I think that we have individuals, professional individuals like you guys, that are preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. So thank you for that. And again, just wanted to add, if you don't want anything to happen, don't get old.
Did you have anything to add?
No, Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, everything's been covered pretty clearly. There are risks in anything you do. For us as first responders, you have given us the gavel there to go move forward, protect you, protect the public. That's what we're here for. That's why we train. We continue to train, and there's going to be risk in everything we do. But just, at the end of the day, break on, everybody goes home.
Okay. Technology has improved in the last half hour. That's great. Mr. Chairman, I just will close by saying that I think we're making a mistake if we look at what we think are the negatives and the potentials to go wrong, but we really don't take a good, strong look at the benefits of the whole tech project. And it started off as an economic development initiative. The southeast corner of the state has really made itself in what they call here in Hobbs the energy plex, and there's just a whole lot of really very good industry activity that's going on. And so I hope that when we hear from Holtec later, we're going to get a little bit more discussion about the benefits, so we can actually weigh that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator,
Maybe I
yes,
may just
you
be
have
a little loud. Thank you. I just wanted to make just a final comment here that as we do this, I would implore our state departments to continue or to do what they can to work with us, because we truly do need to have some resources to turn to. I just read here about the DOE doing a technical study and finding identified at least three aspects of spent nuclear fuel for high radioactive waste, and high radioactive waste, I should say, for in transportation, which could result in increased radiation exposures to transportation workers, members of the general public, and emergency response. This is a technical study that they have done and identified that. So there are areas that we truly need to be very cognizant about and continue to look at as we proceed with this. One of the least things we all want here is that is to be safe overall. And so that's all I have to say, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Lorenzo, perhaps you, were any of you in your jobs prior to WIP, maybe starting your careers or your Raincoat?
I can honestly say I was actually part of the SWAT team when they broke ground for Urenco, so I've been here since Urenco ever opened and they broke ground. WIP, no, I think they were already here.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, my
Understanding was with those facilities, there was a lot of coordination with the federal government, and of course, WIP is a federal facility, and there was a lot of similar types of conversations back then. You can imagine even more concern because we didn't have any experience dealing with nuclear waste issues, and but there was a lot of outreach between the Department of Energy, local communities. As I understand it, there was actual investments made in local communities in beefing up their emergency preparedness. And I guess right now, do the federal government, you mentioned how much research dollars you've gotten or the training, do these entities actively fund training in emergency preparedness in your communities right now?
Mr. Chairman, representatives, the funding that we get is part of the training too. You do get the training also. And the funding that we get, it also covers some of the training. So when you get the equipment, you also get the training with it.
Taxpayer funding?
And we work really close with Aramco, with WIP. Whatever we need, if we're lacking in something, they don't hesitate to come and talk to us as, what do you need to make your work a lot better for us? So we have a good working relationship with them. With all this funding that we get, again, we do get the training with it. So it's great.
I think in our area, we're very fortunate, like Lorenzo said, to be able to pick up the phone and call other agencies, or I've worked closely with the emergency manager from WIP and the emergency management team over there. We borrow each other's equipment. We interagency train. If I have questions in regards to emergency management, I call Lorenzo. We all have a very close working relationship. And as far as funding, yes, a couple years ago maybe, I can't remember the exact year, but 2 years ago, I believe, we received a grant from DOE. And from that grant, we were able to get training, equipment. The city continues to get an amount, every year, as well as the county, and we continue to train on that. The city has a hazmat team that was put together that was actually funded by that, and they were able to get equipment and training and continue with that.
Did you want to answer? Chief, you don't have to. Okay.
And ma'am, you had mentioned that Holtec reached out to you and that you had a conference call. Have you had anything beyond that?
No, sir.
Okay. So just a, hey, we're here and we'll talk later. Sir.
Mr. Chairman and representatives, I would like to say something about Holtec. They did reach out to us. We've had 2-3 meetings. All of our first responders, even the mayor from Hobbs was there. So we've had a lot of relationships with them. And we've expressed some of the things that we need to cover. And they're open-minded. They're willing to work with us to make sure that the plan that they have in place that they showed us is going to work for Lee County, since the facility will be in Lee County.
Well, let me ask you this. Would you recommend that any community that would maybe be impacted or could deal with an emergency response situation, that it would be a good thing for those communities to be afforded the same outreach, the same investment as Eddy and Lee County have had? Is that appropriate in your mind?
Mr. Chairman, representatives, any committee that this material goes through should have the opportunity. Should. Now keep in mind where this facility is located in Lee County. It's in the middle of nowhere where very, very little people live close by.
That's not true.
It's a safe area.
Industry is heavy through that area.
But
These are every day.
again, this material is going through some community. They should be given the opportunity.
Anybody else? Yes.
Just on that point, with you all having such, with you all having such extensive experiences with WHIP and with Urenco, and listening to you and having heard you before,
I'd say you all are probably the experts in the state on working with, emergency or hazardous preparedness. And so I would just like to invite you all to extend your expertise. It's a training module to help other areas that may not have had as intimate, training and received the funding that now these trains are going to come across their communities. Because I know every community, I live in Corrales, and we have a volunteer police department, a volunteer fire department, but they get training, and so I would just like to maybe recommend that since you all are the experts here in the state of New Mexico when it comes to this, and maybe developing a module to where all of these other areas that these trains may come through, that provide them some training, because you're getting the funding. And I know with your funding, from being a trainer who has got federal funds, that you can also get funds to help other areas. And so that's just a comment, but maybe that would, help address this whole issue, since you all are the experts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody else on the committee?
I just want to thank you all for coming today, and I really appreciate what you said about plan for the worst and hope for the best. And as emergency responders, the best thing you can do for us as policymakers, elected officials, and the public you serve is to give us the unvarnished truth and do everything you can to keep us safe and drive a hard bargain. And I think your job, frankly, like this committee, are not to be cheerleaders, but to be defenders, to be watchdogs. And we have economic development people who cheerlead. But your job, and we really appreciate what you do, is to keep us safe, to ask the tough questions that aren't necessarily popular. That's your job. And I know you've been asked some other kinds of questions today, but thank you all very much for what you do. Be safe out there, and thank you to the committee. With that, we will, let's break for a little bit of lunch, no?
Invitation to the mayor's permission. Either before lunch or after lunch. Take a minute, and I'd love for you all to tour the Corps. That's one of the reasons we wanted to meet here, is your call.
We're about 15 minutes ahead of schedule, so we have an optional tour for those that want to join and see a tour of this beautiful facility.
Mayor, would that?
Yeah, let me go get some seconds.
Okay.
It'll take about 15 minutes.
We go swimming. I come from Las Cruces.
Thank you all. Okay, everybody, the lunch that's being provided, unfortunately, there's, as I understand, only enough for the committee, so I apologize. You might want to go grab a little bit of a bite. And we'll be back here at 12:45 for public comment. Do we have a sign-up sheet for that? Where is it? We have a sign-up sheet. If you want to speak for public comment, make sure you've signed in for the sheet. And we appreciate it. 12:45.